For more on all of this, we turn to three people with extensive experience dealing with Afghanistan. David Sedney served in Afghanistan on the National Security Council staff and then as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. Retired Army Colonel David Lamb was the Chief of Staff to the Combined Forces Command in Afghanistan in 2004 and 2005. He's now at the National Defense University. And Pamela Constable covers South Asia for the Washington Post. She's recently back from Kabul. Recently back as in last week. Pamela, tell us a little bit about these two things that happened today. How much of a difference does it make that there's a handover and is Afghanistan ready? And how much of difference does it make that they're going to Qatar for these meetings?
It's been really quite a set of stunning developments. When I was there just a few weeks ago, everything was gloom and doom. I mean, the Taliban were exhibiting extraordinary ferocity and reach and going after international charities, even going after International Red Cross, Supreme Court. They really seemed to be going for broke. So this, obviously, we're now learning that there was this double track going on, and they've been quietly negotiating with American officials and others the whole time. But, they're very good at playing games, and so we're not going to read too much
into Taliban,
this.
you mean?
Correct. We can't read too much into them saying that they want to talk. They've been wanting to talk with the Americans for a long time. It's the Afghans they don't want to talk with.
Which leads to my next question, Colonel Lamb. Is Hamid Karzai prepared either to go to that table and also to accept the security responsibilities that are now being put in his lap?
Well, for a long time, his major issue would be to negotiate with the Taliban, but he is pretty adamant about those negotiations being conducted in Afghanistan. He is not a big fan of them being carried on outside the country, nor is he a big fan of having bilateral negotiations going on between the U.S., Taliban. A year or so ago, the British and the U.S. and the Taliban. He considers that a bilateral issue that he needs to deal with the Taliban, and that needs to happen in Afghanistan. The Taliban, on the other hand, don't recognize Karzai's government, and that poses a big problem.
David Sedney, is what we're seeing happening, the stunning events that Pamela Constable describes, is it symbolic or is it real?
I think it's both. It's both symbolic in the sense that this is a real turning point in the transition of lead security responsibility to the Afghans today. That shows that the commitment of the United States and the international community to build Afghan security forces that are able to defend their own country is coming to fruition. But at the same time, the desire of all Afghans, including the Taliban, for peace after 35 years of war is reflected in this agreement to begin talks. So I agree with Pamela. This is a really important development. It's symbolic, but I think there are going to be a lot of things that are going to play out over this summer, and we'll see a very different situation in Afghanistan by the end of this fighting season, by the end of September.
Pam, the president said today there are going to be bumps in the road. He was talking not just about these meetings in Qatar, he was also talking about the handover, right?
Well, yes, there's so many aspects to this. Number one, there's been a lot of sort of rosy, optimistic views on the state of the Afghan defense forces by those who've spent huge amounts of money and effort and time and lives to train them. But honestly, especially when we're talking about outside the Army, there's a great deal of progress that needs to be made before they can really stand up. And even within the Army, there's a lot of concern about factional and ethnic divisions within the Army and the leadership there. So that's a great concern. It's not only about being able to fight, it's about the will to fight. And the other bump in the road, which everyone in Afghanistan is very worried about, is whether Karzai, in fact, is going to be willing to step down and leave power as he has promised to do and as the Constitution requires him to do.
Let me ask Colonel Lamb about that, because there is an election which is looming, and that is the political potential is also a huge bump, potentially.
The political bump is the most high-risk bump of them all. The election has to be secured. If we have indeed passed security over to the Afghan forces, I noticed the words they used was we've passed control over to the Afghan forces this week. I would venture to say that we've passed responsibility and potential blame for what happens. I'm not sure they're in control. Given all that, that same set of security forces now has to secure an election process. And my experience with that in 2005 and then the subsequent election, well, 2004 and then the subsequent election, is that's a difficult task. It was a major effort for the Americans and allies while we were in Afghanistan, and I'm not sanguine on the outcome there. I think it might be a task too far for the Afghan security forces.
What do you think about that, David Sedney?
I'm much more optimistic. I believe that the Afghan security forces have already shown over the last 6 to 9 months the ability to take on the security responsibilities for their own country. And they've done that by defeating those attacks that Pamela mentioned. She's correct that there was a lot of lashing out by the Taliban, but they've not taken back any territory that they had lost in the previous year.
So even attacks like this Red Cross attack that she referenced, that is not worrying to you?
Oh, certainly it's worrying and it's concerning that the Taliban have gone after an international institution like the Red Cross. But that doesn't mean that they are regaining territory. They're not regaining the support of people. In fact, they're losing support from the people, and they are in a position where they really need to come to the table.
Is there a distinction that can be drawn about progress in urban areas, Pam, versus progress in the rural areas? And that we not overstate whatever we see or don't see?
I would say there's a fairly big difference, particularly talking about the ability of security forces to repel and respond to attacks. They've been doing a very good job in the cities. But in the cities, you have multiple sources. You have the local police, you have the intelligence police, you have special police forces, and you have the army, as well as backup from international forces at a distance. So they've got a lot more ability to zero in and go after and get some of these suicide bombers and get some of these gunmen out of there. In remote rural districts, it's much more difficult. The Afghan army is spread very, very thin. Police even thinner and not as well trained, and local police forces, which are being stood up now to defend villages with almost no training at all. So the picture is much less sanguine out, particularly certain areas. There are districts in many, many provinces that are essentially under Taliban control, not necessarily thickly filled with foot soldiers, but psychologically under Taliban control.
I want to ask you, David Lamb, about another piece of this, which is the economics of the situation. Not only whether there's the underlying economic strength in Afghanistan to support these transitions, but also how much this is going to cost and who's going to pay.
Well, from the Afghan National Security Forces side, I think the number is about $4.1 billion a year, of which we're going to ask Europeans for about $2.1 billion. The Afghans themselves have to contribute about $500 million to that, and the rest to be settled will be the United States. I think what we should be prepared for is the United States to pick up most of that bill, if not all of that bill. Because if the political process in the election becomes unraveled, political will in many of these countries, particularly our European allies, they're going to say, what is this all about? Why are we putting more money into this effort? I think the Americans have to be ready to go that entire bag of money alone.
Does that mean, David Sedney, that it's too soon for Americans to breathe easy and say, we are backing out of Afghanistan, even with deadlines looming next year, even with this handover today?
I agree that it's something that we can't rest easy on, but at the same time, I think we should feel quite proud that what we said we were going to do, we've done. We've built up the Afghan security forces. We've driven the Taliban to a situation where they can be controlled by the Afghan forces. I take a little different view than Pamela on that. There are areas where the Taliban are in control of some districts, but these are not areas that they've retaken control in the last year. The Afghan security forces have kept what they've won over the last year, and they're going to start pushing out, and particularly in the Taliban heartland areas of Helmand and Kandahar provinces, the areas where the Taliban started. That's where the real key battle has been fought over the last 3 years, and that's where the Taliban has suffered the greatest reverses.
But the U.S., this cannot happen without continued U.S. pressure and involvement.
With U.S. support at this point. The U.S. and our NATO allies, we're not leading the operations. We're not planning the operations. We're providing support. We're standing behind the Afghans. And what they're showing, and sometimes they suffer tactical setbacks on the battlefield, but they're always going back to the places where they've been pushed out of, taking that territory back and pushing the Taliban further back on their heels.
David Sedney, David Lamb, Pam Constable, thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
Welcome.